This emerged out of the fear of Black people from slavery, that there was this massive fear about these slave revolts, Black people demanding their freedom, being willing to have an uprising to gain their freedom. And what that meant then was that you had this language of, we've got to keep this ferocious monster in chains. And you saw with each revolt, with each uprising, a series of statutes being put in place to say that African American, that the enslaved, that Black people could not own weapons, that they could not have access to weapons. And you also saw the rise and the structure of slave patrols and militias that were there and designed to contain that Black population. As the nation began to develop, as you had this war of independence, there was this fear of arming Black people, the fear that even free Blacks who were armed would provide a kind of sense of what freedom looked like to the enslaved. But the exigencies of war required that arming, required having Black folks in the Continental Army. But as the nation developed after that war, one of the things that you had happening was with the Constitution, with the drafting of the Constitution, because the militias themselves had proven so untrustworthy, unreliable as a force to fight against the British invasion, that James Madison, in drafting the Constitution, had language in there that you would have federal control of the militias. Well, when the Constitution went up for ratification to the states, by the time it got to Virginia, the Anti-Federalists in Virginia were in an uproar. George Mason and Patrick Henry were thinking about this militia being under the control of the federal government. They were like, we will be left defenseless. We cannot trust the federal government that has these folks from Pennsylvania and these folks from Massachusetts to be willing to engage the militia when the slaves revolt. We cannot trust the federal government to protect us. We will be left defenseless. And they began to demand a Bill of Rights that would provide protection, that would curtail federal power. And they began to demand as well a new constitutional convention. That threat of what that meant sent James Madison into the first Congress determined to write a Bill of Rights that would quell that dissent, that would short circuit that movement for a new constitutional convention. And we've already seen what the power of the South has meant in terms of when the Constitution was being drafted itself, how the South said that we will not sign on to become part of this United States of America if we don't get the 3/5 clause, if we don't get 20 additional years on the Atlantic slave trade, if we don't get a fugitive slave clause. And so the South had already wielded its power in terms of being willing to scuttle the United States of America. And Madison believed strongly that this threat coming out of the Anti-Federalists in the South, out of Virginia, would do the same thing. And that becomes the basis for this Second Amendment.
And can you talk about all of the players? I mean, you just mentioned James Madison, Patrick Henry, the slave states, and how this country came together based on this terror of slaves rebelling, enslaved people rebelling.
Yeah, the enslaved people rebelling, and that fear that, so you have George Washington, who is a slave owner, who brings, in fact, some of his enslaved people to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. You have Thomas Jefferson, who is not there, but he is writing in to Madison, and Madison is writing to him. And one of the things that Jefferson is concerned about is slavery. is the way that it will be depicted. And so you have this silence. There is a silence in the Constitution. It's hovering over the formation of the Constitution, like Banquo's ghost, haunting it, in shaping it, but not being explicitly said. But it is the power that is creating this sophistry, this really weird, we believe in freedom and equality, but we want 20 additional years in the Atlantic slave trade. What they said in South Carolina was that South Carolina would be just a backward place. Our wealth comes from the Negroes. That is our natural resource, and we must protect it at all cost. So this is what is the part of the tectonic plates moving at this time in this founding of this nation.
Professor Anderson, could you also explain the significance of the Uniform Militia Act of 1792 and its role in ensuring that weapons and guns remained in the hands of white people?
Yes, and so one of the first laws passed by Congress was the Uniform Militia Act of 1792. What it said was that all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 45 would have to be part of the militia. And so here in the law, it is specifying white men. And it said that they must own a gun. This is part of, the militia is part of citizenship. It is how you give your service to the nation, how you provide your bona fides, as it were, as an American citizen. And so white men are the definition of American citizen in this framing, and that they must own a gun. And so what you see here is that the militia is given this high status in terms of what it means to be able to control an unruly population, what is seen as a dangerous population. And
Professor Anderson,
interestingly enough, I'm sorry. Interestingly enough for me is that we have had a Shays Rebellion that happened right before the Constitutional Convention, where white men gathered together to attack the government because they didn't like a taxation policy, and that the militia would not put down these white men. In fact, you had members of the militia joining this rebellion. And you had to have Boston merchants basically finance a mercenary army to put down Shays Rebellion. But what you didn't see coming out of that was a law saying, white men with arms are dangerous. White men with arms attack the government. So we need to ban white men from having access to weapons. You don't see that happening, but you do see that happening with slave revolts. You see the language, the laws coming in place saying they shall not have access, Black people shall not have access to weapons, and that the militia and the slave patrol are there to ensure that Black people do not have access to weapons.
And Professor Anderson, it seems, you begin your book by talking about the police murders of Philando Castile as well as Alton Sterling. And you point out that the NRA did not come to their defense, despite the fact that they were also killed for having guns in their possession, whereas in a comparable violence perpetrated by whites, mass violence, the NRA immediately leapt to the defense of the people responsible for that violence, who were white men.
Absolutely. And so there was basic silence on Philando Castile. There was nothing said about Alton Sterling. And what was said about Philando Castile from the NRA was, and this was only after being pushed by their African-American members, was that we believe that everyone, regardless of race, sexual orientation, should have access to guns, to arms. but nothing really substantive. What happened after Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, with the Branch Davidian was that Wayne LaPierre called out federal officers as being jackbooted government thugs who believe they have the right to storm into people's homes and take their guns and kill law-abiding citizens. Federal officers had been killed in those events. And so to then label the response as jackbooted thugs when you get silence with Philando Castile, it really led me to, as journalists were asking, don't African Americans have Second Amendment rights? And that's what sent me down this path all the way to the 17th century to be able to answer that question. We're in this moment where the Second Amendment is like hallowed ground. It is sacred. It is one of those things that has been defined as the bedrock of citizenship. And so I started looking. And as I went on this journey, what I saw was that it wasn't about guns. It was about the fear of Black people. It was about the fear of Blackness. It was about the societal labeling of Black people as dangerous, as a threat to whites, and that this architecture comes in place in order to contain this Black population, in order to provide security and safety to the white community from this fear of Black people. And then you get this really weird matrix happening where Black people are feared but needed. And so it is how do we contain them? How do we snuff out their quest for freedom? How do we snuff out their quest for their basic human rights while also keeping them as labor without rights? How do we do that? How do we make that subjugation happen? How do we talk about, in this land of the United States of America, how do we talk about freedom, but try to keep it contained from this Black population? We don't want them getting the ether that we're talking about in this revolutionary moment about freedom and democracy and justice. We don't want them hearing the words about equality. How do we do that? And when there was a revolt in Virginia in 1800 with Gabriel, and Gabriel had fed on the language, the revolutionary language from the United States, from the French Revolution, and from the Haitian Revolution. That sent shockwaves throughout the United States. And Virginia was trembling at the expansiveness of Gabriel's revolt. And the response was, the wrong people are getting the word about freedom and democracy. The wrong people are hearing this revolutionary language and thinking that it applies to them. So this was the journey that I was on to hear and to get into this milieu of how frightening, how dangerous Black people were seen as, and then to follow it all the way through to the 21st century by looking at, do Black people have the right to bear arms? Do they have the right to a well-regulated militia? Do they have the right to self-defense? And seeing how in each of those it has been used against Black people. And that the legal status of Black folk has not altered that significantly. So whether enslaved, whether free Black, whether denizen, which was that halfway limbo land between enslaved and citizen, whether newly emancipated freed people, whether Jim Crow Black, or whether post-civil rights African American. The right to bear arms, the right to a well-regulated militia, and the right to self-defense are in fact fractured. That citizenship is fractured. It is hobbled by this intense anti-Blackness, this fear of Black people, this sense of Black people as a danger to white American society.